What's up guys, LeopoldTheBrave here, and last week I made an Infinity Train video. The character 1-1 versus Portal's GLaDOS in an epic artificial intelligence battle. And rewatching Infinity Train for research was quite a fun trip, as well as playing Portal 2. But then I realized I haven't really talked about Infinity Train on this channel before. Which is odd because it's one of my favorite cartoons ever. It's an anthology series where each season, or book, is a completely different story that follows different characters. Each season is only 10 episodes long and each episode is only 11 minutes long, so you could binge the entire series in a single afternoon if you wanted to, which I'd recommend before coming back to this video, because I will be talking about spoilers as I rank my favorite seasons. Now I want to remind you all that this is entirely my opinion. In addition to the themes being more mature than your average cartoon, they're also more specific. Each story is very character driven as their adventure on the train follows their internal journeys. So each book is going to hold a different amount of important weight to each person depending on how well they relate. So just keep that in mind. This isn't a ranking of best to worst, it's a ranking of favorite to least favorite. So let's review each book and at the end I'll give you my ranking. Let's begin. Starting off, of course, at book 1, we have the Perennial Child, and it's going to be a very hard one to beat. It follows the story of Tulip Olsen, dealing with her parents' recent divorce and learning to adapt to the big changes in her life. And I like how the show wastes no time getting to that either. They just dive straight in and let you know that this one's gonna be different. After plans to go to game design camp promised by her parents fall through due to their poor scheduling, Tulip runs away in anger to find the camp herself. This only leads to her ending up on the Infinity Train instead. And because at this point in time the train had been taken over by a woman named Amelia, Tulip didn't get an instructional video telling her how the train worked, forcing her to figure it out herself. Luckily, she wouldn't have to do it alone, with companions Atticus and 1-1 joining her. Atticus is a mighty king of a quirky kingdom, and 1-1 is a quirky little robot with some memory issues. They mostly serve as comedic relief to help balance out against Tulip's emotional weight, but not to the point where they can't be taken seriously as well. You'll end up caring about them just as much as Tulip does, and want them all to see a happy ending. So, on her journey, Tulip discovers that in order to leave the train and go back home, she needs to get the number on her hand down to 0, by traveling through different train cars and learning lessons. But there are of course some obstacles along the way. Aside from some of the train cars' challenges being a bit difficult, there's also the previously mentioned Amelia attempting to stop them. Amelia is actually after them because of 1-1, the true conductor of the train that she took over. Her motivation being that after she lost a loved one, she wanted to recreate her life in one of the train cars that still had her loved one in it, but 1-1 wouldn't let her. While Tulip's and Amelia's struggles came from different sources, they both had the common factor in that they needed to accept the next big chapter in their lives. Overall, it was a pretty simple moral and lesson to learn, but the way they conveyed it through these very personal and mature themes was definitely amazing. I honestly can't really think of any drawbacks or criticisms or anything. It was just a well-rounded, well-paced, and really well-told story. It feels like it's exactly what the creator wanted to make, and seeing what the show became after the evolution from the pilot 3 years beforehand will always be mind-blowing. Book 2 gives us Cracked Reflection as we follow Mirror Tulip, or MT for short. Now this is a character we met back in Book 1, in one of the cars that Tulip visited. Tulip helped her escape the mirror world, and now she seeks to escape the train entirely. As well as Tulip's identity, wanting to form her own, eventually adopting the name Lake. Just like the original Tulip though, she couldn't make the journey on her own. She needed a couple companions to help her. And thankfully she had a pair. There's Jessie, another passenger on the train who she stumbles across, and Alan Dracula, a mute deer with a countless amount of weird abilities. Now this season's a bit different because the end game is more goal-based rather than character-driven. No matter how it's done, the end goal is just wanting to get Lake off the train. From the very start, she already has her new identity figured out and knows who she is. There's no real room for her to grow as a character. It's the rest of the world that has the problem with her. So we don't really get to see her develop or go through an interesting arc throughout the season beyond just being nicer to Jessie. But thankfully, Jessie is a passenger, whose key to getting off the train is linked to how he grows as a person. So we do still get that Infinity Train brand character goodness. Jesse's problem is that he's a victim of peer pressure. He's a total yes man, and will go along with anything if he thinks it'll make people like him more. Just seeking the validation of others rather than being his own person, which I can kinda relate to in some aspects. This is definitely a more basic and general moral compared to the previous season, but I think they did the best they possibly could with it. Jesse has some fantastic scenes here. We also get more lore about how the train works and see where passengers get their numbers. And I love how 1-1 is completely neutral here. He doesn't really care about the wants or needs of others. He's a robot, he's just in it for the math and science. Which is one of the connections for why I had him fight GLaDOS last week. I just think it makes him a more interesting character. One criticism I'd have to give though is that when they dive into the train lore, they don't quite dive in enough. For example, Jesse just somehow comes back to the train after leaving. Like, how did he get back on the train at will? And is wanting to bring someone off the train really a big enough deal to get back on the train? It wasn't even a problem Jesse had with himself, it was a problem Jesse had with the train. It just feels like they had no idea how to end Lake's story and it was too late for them to undo Jesse leaving the train early. But other than that, it was a very solid season. Next up is Book 3, The Cult of the Conductor, and this season is something different. It stars Grace and Simon, again characters we got a brief glimpse of in the previous season. But these aren't your typical passengers, they don't want to get off the train. They see the potential within the train and want to seize its power and resources for themselves. They believe everything on the train belongs to them, and by leading their group called the Apex, they're able to take control of it all and silence any of the train's residents who try to stand in their way. In their eyes, they had a pretty good thing going, but things start to fall apart once Grace and Simon accidentally get split up from the rest of their group. On their way back, they come across a little girl named Hazel who at first appears to be a passenger, and a giant purple gorilla named Tuba, a denizen of the train who has pretty much become Hazel's mom. Wanting to recruit Hazel for their group the Apex, Grace and Simon are forced to also bring Tuba along, as the two are inseparable. While Simon is irritated, seeing Tuba as merely an object of the train that doesn't even matter, hoping to wean Hazel off the gorilla over time, Grace slowly begins to realize that these denizens, or nulls as she's labeled them, are actual people with their own lives that go on whether passengers come by or not. And if that wasn't enough, they also come across Amelia, or the false conductor. Grace realizing that the foundation she built the Apex on was a lie, while Simon believes Amelia is the liar. All of this conflict builds and builds until Grace and Simon clash. The conflict of swallowing your pride and changing your worldview versus hardening your heart and becoming more stubborn and set in your ways. It's a pretty heavy and loaded theme, and there's some very heavy scenes that complement it amazingly. But I do have a little problem with the ending. I'm not saying Simon got off too hard, he absolutely deserved everything that came to him. But Grace definitely got off a bit too easily. While they started off the season with the same mindset, it's not a mindset they developed together. Grace had that mindset first and planted it in Simon when he was vulnerable and traumatized. They even point out in her tape how Grace helped Simon become what he is today, but simply acknowledging a flaw doesn't make it go away, especially since Grace goes back on it later on, telling Simon she's not responsible for him at all. And throughout this entire climax, they have him going full crazy over-the-top anime villain, so you'll ignore that fact. Overall, Book 3 is an incredible journey, it just face-planted right at the end. And finally, we come to Book 4, Duet. And this one is not making it to the top anytime soon. I'll go ahead and say that. I mean, it's not a bad season, there are no bad seasons of Infinity Train, it's just the least good one. It follows the story of Ryan and Mingi, dual package passengers. Now these two have been friends literally since birth, and they grew up together with the dream to play music. But they slowly began to drift apart, mostly due to Mingi's strict family. And it ultimately resulted in Mingi ditching their dream in a moment of stage fright and anxiety. They go their separate ways after this, but reunite years later when Ryan shows up at Mingi's workplace with a new opportunity. Mingi rejects though, so Ryan forces his hand, and that's how these two end up on the Infinity Train. You know, where they figure out how to be friends again, or figure out that Mingi has to go with Ryan, or something. And you can already begin seeing where this book has issues. One moment the train decides their numbers are synced and they're a package deal and they have to solve the same problem together. And then another moment it decides their numbers aren't synced and they have to figure out their own little problems separately. It just feels super inconsistent, and we spend a good half the season with the duo arguing endlessly and making zero progress. It's just not fun to watch. Especially since they're also stuck with the worst companion in the entire series, Kez the Bell. 90% of the obstacles they face and come across on the train are Kez's fault, and she doesn't even apologize for it, and she gets away scot-free. Because someone else was mean to her and hurt her feelings first. There's a big scene later on where Ryan blows up at her and lists everything that's wrong with Kez, and Mingi agrees. They then try to play it like the duo was too harsh on her, but no, they were completely right. Just like Grace setting Simon's path, simply acknowledging the flaw doesn't make it go away. And the remainder of that episode, plus some of the next, just becomes a big pity party for the Bell, while the duo takes a back seat until they magically get their doors. I know at the start of this segment I said it wasn't a bad season, but now that I've summarized it and I'm thinking about it more, I just really didn't like it. Plus it had Pig Baby. Not gonna waste any more time and dive right into the rankings, especially since after that last segment, the first thing I'm gonna say is pretty obvious. In 4th place is the 4th book. I get that they wanted to go with something lighthearted after how heavy Season 3 was, but that more mature tone was part of Infinity Train's initial identity. There were definitely some sparks of greatness in there, but not enough to satisfy me. Especially since it was the last season. I know the creators intended to make more, but that doesn't change the fact that it was the last one. And again, in case you forgot, it's the season with Pig Baby. There's no saving that. In 3rd place is Book 2. Now it may be second to last, but don't worry, it's leagues above Book 4. It had an incredible and deep story, it taught a fun lesson with Jessie, and Lake, despite being a bit flat, was an interesting protagonist. The only things keeping it down is one episode where a parasite takes over Alan Dracula and all the lore mishaps towards the end. It still kinda bugs me. In 2nd place is Book 3, and I know this is gonna be a bit of a hot take. This seems to be like most people's favorite book, but it also appears that that's mainly because of those "that really happened on a kids show" scenes. Overall, it was an amazing adventure with a lot of boundary-pushing moments, but those moments are what I'll be pointing to whenever I look back at the season fondly, rather than the adventure as a whole. Like that trip and fumble at the end I mentioned previously. And unlike my number 1 season, Book 1. From start to finish, Book 1 was everything I had hoped for after following the pilot for about 3 years. It was the most well-paced, it had the best companions, and it had a deep and personal moral that tons of people could connect with in different ways. It's the season that feels the most like it got to be what it set out to be. It didn't write itself into any holes, it didn't tweak itself to push its moral further. There's just no problems with it that I can think of. I'm glad we got more Infinity Train after this, but if Book 1 was all we got, then I would have been satisfied. I can't say that about any of the other books. But let me know what you guys think. What are your Infinity Train book rankings and why? Put it in the comment section below and I'll be sure to read it, and I'll see you guys next time. Leopold the Brave, out.